Ja, ik zal nog even een korte introductie geven over het Nederlands Hartnetwerk. Als jullie dat niet erg vinden, doe ik dat nog even in het Nederlands. En daarnaast ook over de subsidie die we dus gekregen hebben. Joko, next slide please. Ja, om te beginnen dus even een korte introductie van het Nederlands Hartnetwerk. Voor degenen die daar nog niet bekend mee zijn. Het Nederlands Hartnetwerk is een samenwerkingsverband tussen zorgaanbieders uit de eerste, tweede en derde lijn in de regio Zuidoost-Brabant. En hierbij zijn onder andere ziekenhuizen, medisch specialistische bedrijven en ook huisartsengroepen aangesloten. Daarnaast ook bijvoorbeeld diagnostische centra, ambulancedienst, trombosedienst. En gezamenlijk komt dat uit op een adherentiegebied van zo'n 800.000 personen. En ondertussen is ook regio Weert aangesloten binnen dit samenwerkingsverband. Joko, next slide please. Het Nederlands Hartnetwerk heeft als doel om de hoogste patiëntwaarde te bieden voor patiënten met een hartaandoening. Dus dat wil zeggen de beste patiëntrelevante uitkomsten tegen de laagst mogelijke zorgkosten. Waarmee het Nederlands Hartnetwerk ook aansluit bij de gedachte van value-based healthcare. Dus daar zijn we heel erg mee bezig. Joko, next slide please. Ja, en dan nog even over de subsidie die we gekregen hebben vanuit ZonMW. De subsidie uitkomstgericht organiseren en betalen. En daarmee proberen we eigenlijk op gestructureerde wijze inzichten op te halen en te delen over een uitkomstgerichte organisatie en verbeteraanpak over de hele zorgketen. En daarbij hebben we eigenlijk 3 onderdelen gespecificeerd. Ten eerste de evaluatie van de impact van het Nederlands Hartnetwerk op patiëntrelevante uitkomsten en zorgkosten. Ten tweede de evaluatie van de impact van verschillende innovaties die door het Nederlands Hartnetwerk ontwikkeld en geïmplementeerd zijn in de regio. En dan kun je bijvoorbeeld denken aan de introductie van nieuwe klinische protocollen of de introductie van digitale zorg via een e-health programma. En ten derde, en dat is ook het onderdeel waar we vandaag iets over zouden willen vertellen, richten we ook op het ophalen van factoren die faciliterend of belemmerend werken bij de ontwikkeling, implementatie en toepassing van waardegedreven bekostigingsmodellen. En voor dit derde onderdeel hebben we dus in nauwe samenwerking met onderzoekers van Universiteit Maastricht, dus Diogo, Wim en Milena, hebben we enkele studies uitgevoerd om meer inzicht te krijgen daarin, om dit ook in de praktijk te kunnen toepassen. En Diogo, dat is onze hoofdonderzoeker, die zal jullie daar meer over vertellen. En zoals al benoemd zal hij dat in het Engels doen, aangezien hij Portugees is. So, Diogo, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Right before I start my presentation, because I'm sharing it, if anyone has any questions, just interrupt me, because I cannot see the raising hands or the emojis since I only have the one column. So if you have any questions, just feel free to just interrupt me. That's totally fine. As probably Lisa already explained, it was already introduced. This presentation will be about the facilitating and inhibiting factors in both the design, in the implementation, and in the applicability of value-based payment models. We conducted 2 studies regarding this topic, which we would like to present you. That was a systematic literature review and Delphi study. And of course, this was conducted by the team that you can see here in the slide, both of me, Milena and Wim from UM, as well as then the team from the NHN, Paul, Dennis, Lisa, and Frederic as well. We will then start. I will start this presentation by the methodology and then, of course, the findings, being that the most important of the systematic literature review. And then subsequently, I will present the same thing in the Delphi study. We adhered here to the same timeline as we made our project. So first we did the literature review and then the Delphi study. So this is the same order that this presentation will have. So a really quick introduction regarding this whole topic. So value-based healthcare, it primarily aims to improve value for patients, and that's defined as improving health outcomes against equal or lower costs. And one way to achieve this is to make the reimbursement to providers either partially or fully dependent on the achieved value. And this is known as value-based payment models. So these models, they intend to improve the value for patients. However, and even though there has been a lot of interest and uptake of these models, despite this interest and uptake, evidence on their potential continues to remain mixed and limited. And given this issue, together with the lack of literature, the gap in literature that we found, we then conducted our research. So in this research, we aim to make an overview of the factors that facilitate and or inhibit the successful development, implementation, and applicability of value-based payment models. And since the NHN is within a network of care and transmural care, we adopted this same context as well. And with this, we expect organizations or even individuals to take this overview into account when planning to adopt value-based payment models, as well as gaining some knowledge on the factors that support and the ones to avoid, and ultimately, of course, create value to their patients.
Diego, can I ask a question?
Of course.
A quick question. First of all, very interesting topic. I also wrote a similar paper about this. I can send it to you, but quick question for now is, what do you mean with the difference between implementation and applicability?
So I can actually already go here, because in the systematic literature review, this was kind of the framework that we adopted. And our team, we decided to divide in 3 phases of the model. So first would be the design and the development of the actual model, and then we'll be implementing the model, and then the applicability and evaluation. So when the model is already underway, given this division that we made of the different phases of the model, that's how we organized each of the factors that we found. Of course, there might be some overlap, of course, because this is an organ, it's a living thing in a way, and because of that, even though there's some sort of overlap in the factors that might be integrated into each of the phases, we had, of course, to make some decisions and adopt each and allocate each of the factors to each of the phases. But these were the phases that we developed as a team since beginning up until the model is already underway.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you for the question. Now that we're already here, I'm not going to go back as well. So in this systematic literature review, we asked ourselves in the team, how would we organize these facilitating and inhibiting factors that we found in a systematic literature review? As many articles could be included, we needed a way to organize them. And like I already explained, we decided to organize in 3 phases. So we took a model by Greenhog, which was initially built to study the diffusion of innovations in healthcare. We took some elements from that model. We added other elements ourselves. And as you can see, this is the framework that was built. Like I already said, first we have the design and development, then implementation, and then the applicability. I'm not going to go in and depict each one of them. You will be able to see them later on. But those were the other elements that are within each of the phases. Those are the subcategories to which we allocated each of the factors facilitating and or inhibiting. So in this systematic literature review, we established an inclusion and an exclusion criteria. We took into account the type of payment model, so in this case, value-based, the type of care, transmural, the setting, networks of care, and then the analysis of the payment model. So papers outlining barriers and or facilitators of value-based payment models. We used 7 databases to conduct our search, and we also as a team discussed keywords for the search in several meetings as well. As for the study selection process, there were a total of 5,988 articles that came from the search strategy, and after deduplication, we decided to then have the title and abstract screening of 5,148. And then out of those, the full text screening of 575. At the end, we included 143 articles that came from the screening of those 575 articles, but also the reference list check of reviews that we couldn't, of course, include, but we checked the reference list of those reviews that fulfilled the inclusion and exclusion criteria, as well as the reference check of the studies that we had initially included. So all in all, we had 143 articles to extract data from. And then we also analyzed the quality of those 143 articles. When it comes to the data extraction and analysis, we created a large extraction table with elements like the study design, data collection, outcome measures, facilitators and barriers, among others. And we built a table about regarding the general description of the publications, which I don't think it's necessary to present here in this session. But then we also built other tables regarding the actual facilitating and inhibiting factors, which we will present. So this is one of those tables. I know it doesn't say much if you just look at it face value, but I ask for your attention just, for example, on these three subcategories. So as I already explained with the framework that we devised in order to organize the factors, as you can see in the design and development, among the objectives and strategies, so the factors that are about the objectives and strategies, there's a lot of included articles that described facilitators about objectives and strategies, so 56, as you can see, which comprise almost 40% of the totality of the included studies. And then when it comes to the implementation, the dedicated time and resources was a very prominent subcategory, especially in the inhibiting factors, with 25 articles outlining barriers about it. And then finally, in the applicability, in care coordination, there were a lot of facilitating factors that were also outlined. So 1 in every 4 outlined facilitating factors about this subcategory. Now, like I already said, this doesn't tell you much. And because of that, and we want to make it a little bit clearer, we'll be talking about the actual facilitating and inhibiting factors that we found. There were a lot of factors that were extracted, and that it would be impossible to present all of them in this session. And because of that, we decided to present you the most frequent factors found by each of the phases. So one of them being the design and development, the other one, the implementation, and then the other one, the applicability of the value-based payment models. So starting out with insufficient funding, this was one of the most frequently found barriers. And as value-based payment models have several moving parts, not just about the design, but also everything that incorporates. And also the staff needs to have some sort of behavioral shift in how the care process is conducted. And because of that, several articles claim that there's a need for enough resources to finance a value-based payment model, and either enough resources or enough connections in order to get those resources, getting funding externally. If that does not happen, of course, it can severely hinder the well-functioning of the model. Related with this barrier, it was also frequently mentioned that smaller organizations, which lack the ability to absorb the startup costs as well as track medication compliance, they get discouraged from making important changes in both the processes and the inputs of care. So this was also a very frequent inhibiting factor that was found. Additionally, and this I'm assuming you almost guessed, we also found that realistic targets and benchmarks, as well as adequate incentives, were very prominent facilitators in the included articles, together with rotating quality measures and new clinical protocols. I also alert you that in this second facilitating factor, the involvement of physicians is also included in the second facilitator I presented, and it deserves more attention because the active involvement of the physicians in the design process of the value-based payment model is several times mentioned, and it increases motivation, it increases engagement, among, of course, other positive consequences. And this importance of the outcome measures and the incentives is also kind of corroborated by the fact that one of the most frequent inhibiting factors was the inadequate outcome measures and insufficient incentives. So this kind of underlines the importance of these factors. factor because it can both facilitate, if present, if adequate, if sufficient, but it can also hinder these value-based payment models if they are inadequate, lacking, insufficient. Finally, we have a diverse team, which was also considered by the studies to be an important facilitator. Having staff with different functions helps the team reach the best processes and the best outcomes, as well as the overall success of the model. All in all, kind of having a small conclusion on this slide, there should be a great focus on whether there is enough funding or the possibility of getting funding for the design and the development of the model. There should be a focus on the adequacy of the targets and of the incentives. And finally, also a focus on the team itself and making sure that it's diverse and with room for everyone to be heard and to contribute, because everyone with different backgrounds have different things to contribute, which will then enrich the design of the model itself. So continuing on to the implementation of the value-based payment models, having experience with the models is considered to be a very important factor. Its existence as a facilitator and its absence as a barrier. And given all the moving parts, as I already mentioned before, having experience with the new changes in processes and behavior, it facilitates the success of the implementation of the model. And a change from models that focus on the quantity to models that focus on the value is also very complex. And the more complex it is, the hardest it is to make the changes to take place and to be effective. So this complexity of the program was also considered to be a very frequent inhibiting factor found. Additionally, we have the motivation, engagement, and trust to be very important factors. And this importance is again highlighted by this factor being both a frequent facilitator and a frequent barrier. Having a motivation that's intrinsic, so it's outside of the realm of monetary gain, is stated to be quite important because incentives can only take you so far. And there needs to be some intrinsic motivation to the team, to the staff. And related to that, we have leadership and management as also very frequent facilitating factors found. So leaders, they create and maintain this motivation for the staff to promote the success of the model. And this also relates to this facilitator, which highlights the importance that it's a very prominent barrier of the excessive amount of time that improvements take to manifest. As you can see in the third barrier, this excessive amount of time that improvements take to manifest is something that leaders might be able to help out with. They can help managing expectations of the staff and in regards to how long it will take for improvements to be visible. There were a lot of articles that did state that just based on this change to a value-based payment model, everyone expected the improvements to take effect right away, and that didn't happen. So leadership and management can help out with that. So there's also, besides the management of expectations, I agree that there should be a focus on both the experience of the staff when it comes to the models and also promoting motivation and trust. Finally, talking about the applicability of the value-based payment models, transparency and communication is considered to be a very important factor while the model is in place and working. And of course, yet again, the fact that the barrier, a very frequent barrier also appears here when it comes to transparency and communication. This highlights the importance of this factor, either as a facilitator when present or as a barrier when lacking. Besides that, the active involvement of medical specialists and physicians in the same process of care is also very important, as well as trainings to all the staff on those same processes of care, as well as briefing the staff on the most important elements of the model so that everyone has some sort of standardized knowledge about the model. So everyone knows, even to the core, there were a lot of articles that mentioned that a lot of team members didn't even have the same idea of what value meant. So training the staff into elements as simple as what they understand by value is also very important, not just the processes of care that underlie in the value-based payment model in place. There are also several articles that do report inequalities, such as the high-performing organizations with already low benchmarks, which don't have much fat to trim. So what this means is that organizations are already so efficient, high-performing, and because of the benchmarks that might be in place of the in the model, they don't have much fat to trim. They don't have a lot of improvements to make because they're already so improved and so high performance. And because of that, organizations that already perform quite well might not have the motivation to join, or at least improve the value for patients when the model is in place. Besides that, we also have the inadequate adjustment of differences in patient mix. So by this, I mean that different patients, a different group of patients might have different, more complexity in terms of the diseases that they have, the conditions. And because of that, the targets, the benchmarks, the incentives might need to be different so that organizations are also motivated to treat those patients and not incur in risk selection behaviors, for example. So all in all, just like I did in the other two phases, there should be a focus on overall transparency and communication, as well as the involvement of the entire team, as well as adjusting for the patient mix, but also adjusting for the organization's targets. So they don't only focus on either absolute targets or relative targets, and have some sort of balance between those, so that all organizations, even the high performing ones, have a motivation to not only participate, but also perform well under the value-based payment models. So this was kind of the findings from the systematic literature review. However, this review only made an overview. I only made an overview of the findings, and we did not focus on identifying the actual importance of those factors. I only told you the ones, I only showed you the factors that were more frequently described, not necessarily the most important ones. So how would we solve for that? We conducted, therefore, a Delphi study. And just like in the review, I will make a short recap of the methodology and then afterwards the findings of the Delphi study. Really quickly, a Delphi technique, for those who might not know, is an approach that answers a certain research question through the identification of consensus among the subject experts. And it kind of allows for reflection among the participants, who are able to reconsider their opinions in the subsequent rounds based on anonymized opinions of others. And this will become clearer when I present you the actual Delphi study that was conducted. So in this case, in our Delphi study, we decided to settle on 3 rounds, and in total, 15 experts were invited to participate. In the first round, 14 out of the 15 experts responded. They were asked to list factors that they consider to be important for the success of value-based payment models. May those be facilitating factors or inhibiting factors. And then based on those factors that they listed, we took those factors and also the factors that made that overview from the systematic literature review, and the team decided to build a list of 40 facilitating factors and 40 inhibiting factors that came from both this list and the overview of the systematic literature review. In the subsequent rounds, the experts were asked to rate the importance of the factors. So in round 2, 14 out of the 15 experts responded. They were asked to rate the importance of the factors in a 5-point Likert scale, being 1 very unimportant and 5 very important. In round 2, they, like I said, they were asked to rate the importance of those 80 factors, 40 facilitating factors and 40 inhibiting factors. And then in round 3, 12 out of the 15 experts responded. They were asked the same thing, but they were given feedback from round 2. And what kind of feedback are we talking about? They were given the median. So out of those 1 to 5 responses of rating the importance, they were given the median for each of the factors, and they were also given the interquartile range. And based on that, then they were asked to finalize. They were given then the feedback, and they rated the importance. And these are then the factors that achieve achieved full consensus in the Delphi study, so the ones that were considered to be the most important ones. And as you can see here, these factors came from rounds 2 and 3, and the motivation and engagement, as well as transparency, communication, and trust, and leadership management and frequent information and feedback were considered to be very important. And I underlined and put these factors in bold because they were both facilitating and inhibiting factors. So these factors, the opposite of each other, were deemed very important by the experts. That's why I underlined them. And because of that, we can kind of conclude that there's this a lot of importance in the less quantifiable elements. A big dynamic is important between the stakeholders involved. And we decided to divide the factors there like this. And as you can see here, the factors that are in green were the ones that were elected by the experts as facilitating factors, very important. So that would be having a clear goal and aligning the incentives, as well as having realistic targets and benchmarks, which kind of goes in hand with what I already presented before in the literature review. In red, you can see the barriers that were deemed very important and achieved full consensus by the experts, and that was the unfair administration and distribution of gains. So if by any chance the savings or the incentives come to the organization and not to the individual, a lot of studies and a lot of experts deemed important that it would be a barrier if there was an unfair distribution and administration of whatever they gained from the value-based payment model. And besides that, also the underutilization of primary care physicians. So going right away to the specialists instead of using primary care physicians was considered to be a very important barrier. And that is, as you can see again, in bold and underlined, we have the adequate outcome measures and quality improvement mechanisms, as well as the integrated information technology system. So having as Lisa already presented, one of those 6 elements that Porter deemed very important in order to achieve value-based payment model. This was also corroborated by these experts as very important. And
can I ask you something about the payment model? Mm-hmm. Do you have? Was there already a different kind of payment model than there is now in cardiological care?
I'm not sure if I understand your question, but in the systematic literature review, we didn't necessarily only elect one type of payment model. So the payment models that we saw in the different studies, they could be shared savings models, pay for performance models, capitation models. There were a lot of models inside. So these factors aren't necessarily allocated to each of the types of payment models. These are general factors that we found. And besides that, and we also had the same question kind of like you had, it may be important also to allocate the different impacts per model. And because of that, we also conducted another systematic literature review on the impact on different value-based payment models. But just
so the Delphi round was about the was about the different kind of models, and was not a model that was used in Holland in the surrounding where you were doing your research now.
Exactly. So it did not have any sort of constraining to the model itself. So the experts were only asked to list factors that they consider to be important overall in value-based payment models, and then they're rating the importance of those factors. So they're not targeting a specific model, no.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
And related to that, Diogo, when you ask the experts for additional factors, which factors did they mention that were not found by you in the literature?
That information, unfortunately, I do not have on me, because the whole process that it went was they were asked to list those factors, and then we compared those factors with the factors that we already had, and most of them were in fact repeated in one way or the other. But I'm not sure if the other elements of the team do know if there were any factors that that the experts themselves listed that were not overviewed. That information, unfortunately, I do not have here.
Because in the framework you showed with the factors that came from the literature, I think there were about 20 or so.
From that framework, I think this is the one that you referred to really quickly. These are not the factors themselves. These will be the subcategories to which the factors are included in. Then we have a very large table, and within each of the subcategories, we have several factors, the actual factors. So for example, this insufficient funding or the smaller organizations, et cetera, these factors were allocated to each of those subcategories.
Okay.
But unfortunately, I do not have the information on the factors that the experts listed that were not in the initial review.
Yeah, I think one interesting thing, at least in my opinion, that came out is that when you look at the literature that's dominated by studies from the US, and in the US you find that many of the value-based initiatives are implemented quite top-down, from the management to the physicians, nurses, and others who are involved, and also are frequently enforced by financial incentives or other forms of incentives. If you look at the studies for the Netherlands, or I think also more broadly in Europe, it's much more bottom-up, where it's initiated by physicians and based on shared opinions or perceptions about how quality can be improved, and then transferred into a sort of payment model, if at all, because I think one of the distinct elements of value-based models here in Europe is that they're not always supported by a payment model, but like the Netherlands Heart Network, for example. So I think that's one thing that is good to realize when you review the literature, that the way that it's implemented is quite different in the US than it's here in Europe, especially here in the Netherlands.
Yeah. Were you guys able to stratify between a more top-down and a bottom-up approach, and whether there were different factors between those approaches?
I think the top-down is much more enforced by financial incentives. And as I said, I think the bottom-up is much more motivated by physicians who want to achieve better health outcomes and quality and improvements in the quality of care that they provide.
Yeah, I can imagine that especially the three non-quantifiable elements on this slide may be less prominent in bottom-up approaches compared to top-down approaches.
Yeah.
Because the intrinsic motivation, for example, is already there.
Yeah, I think that one other element is what you've seen. I think also what you see in the value-based care initiatives here in the Netherlands is that it's because it's bottom up. It's much more difficult to implement it more widely, to generalize it and transfer it to other hospitals than it is in the top-down implemented models.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah, I ask a question to Diogo, which is actually a bit connected to the discussion of Wim and Sander. What my observation is that in the facilitating factors, you have found factors that, you can actually find them in implementation science literature, which really relate with implementation of a substantial improvement or substantial subject. Whereas the inhibiting or impeding factors are more specific, focused on value-based payment. Is that, what do you think about that observation?
So if I understand your question correctly, you're telling me that it looks that the barriers that were found are more related with the value-based payment models, and the facilitators are more general in a way.
Yeah, which are related to what you find in implementation science about implementing substantial improvements. That is, and I recognize that in the facilitating factors.
Mm-hmm.
And the more specific ones are in the impeding factors or the inhibiting factors.
I do agree with you, and especially I think I can show here really quickly why I think that's correct what you're saying, because I also found the same thing. Here, for example, in the systematic literature review, what I found is that in the design and development part, so those more specific elements like you were talking about, there's more barriers allocated to them. So it seems to me that every time there's hindering factors about actually the value-based payment models, those come from the design and development, so more specific elements of the models themselves. So I do agree with you, especially those 30 articles that you can see in the objectives and strategies that are inhibiting factors. So every time, not every time, but most frequently, when there's an unsuccessful or payment model implementation, or when there's an expectation that is not met, that comes from the objectives and strategies. So whether or not the incentives are well placed, to whom, the targets, the benchmarks, etc., etc. And then comes the care coordination itself. So just, and because also we're lack of time, and to build upon what you were asking me, here are kind of the conclusions themselves that we see here. And I do agree that when it comes to the less quantifiable elements, they are not necessarily related just with the value-based payment models. Those are mostly the facilitating factors, and the inhibiting factors come from this first part that you can see here. So the adequate outcomes, measures, targets, benchmarks, and incentives, and having a consensus between the stakeholders on what are the primary objectives and what are the strategies to follow those objectives themselves. Every time that's not in place, it seems to me that the value-based payment models are more often hindered, and more often not achieving the intended objectives. And that, I think, it's corroborated also by the Delphi study and the actual experts stating that first, as you can see in the box, first there needs to be a well-functioning team with a clear goal in mind. So first they need to be all under consensus, then they need to know exactly what is the target, what are the outcomes, what are the measures, and then only after the other components come. And I think this kind of ends the presentation itself, I think, on this note.